How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the third episode of the BlenderNest podcast. We finally have the Patreon going, and we will have this up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all that stuff once we get the Patreon, because it is going to cost us some money, so the Patreon will be helping out with those costs. For the tiers, you have a $1 tier, which is just a thank you for the podcast. We have a $5 tier, which is a bonus episode each month that you will get exclusively on Patreon. You get early access to these episodes, and your name will be in the credits of each episode. And then the VIP Patreon, which is $10 a month, you get the bonus episode, early access, name and credits. You also get a Discord invite, and you get to ask a question on each episode, and we will answer all those questions. So that's the Patreon. For those of you who want to get a part of that and have just help us and join the community, which would be really amazing. Grant Abbott can't make it today. He's sick, so unfortunately we lost a member.
Yeah, we're not sure if he's going to make it. So
we don't know
if he doesn't show up on episode 4, then something might have happened.
So we're running auditions for new members if you're interested.
Yeah, if you guys know someone close to him, contact them. Also, the Blender Conference has been officially announced June 1 through 2, I believe. And I'm personally going to be there. Blender Binge lives in LA, so he'll be there. Anyone else here going?
I'm going to try and go. So
I'll try and go as well. We'll see.
So for those of you who are going to go, you're going to see us there. I have no idea if I'm going to do a talk. If I am, I have to figure out what that's going to be. Also, if you guys know Remington Graphics, I believe he is going as well. So that'll be really, really cool to meet some of you guys and some of the other Blender people, Blender heads and stuff. That'll be really fun. So in today's episode, I wanted to talk to you guys about sort of interview a couple of you about the projects you've done that you're notable for, or just some of your favorites that you've done, and talk about your process. But before we get into that, we do have one question from the last episode. Again, if you guys have any questions, put them in the episode comments and we will answer them. So it says, how do you guys choose who should be on the podcast? Were there other people in the Blender community that you reached out to who said no? How did you guys each start talking to each other? So I'll ask whoever wants to answer that can answer that.
I know that I talked to CG Geek about doing some stuff. There's a lot of CG. There's CG Boost, CG Geek, CG Cookie. I talked to CG Geek about doing kind of some collaboration and stuff, and I knew that he was busy. And I think that once you just hit a certain follower account like that, it just becomes almost difficult to even do these kind of things because you are just so slammed, just working around the clock. But it would be nice to get people like CG Geek, which people have mentioned, CG Boost and Jan Sculpts and Glebs Alexandrov and Andrew Price from Blender Guru. I think all those people would probably be open to appearing on an episode at a time, though I don't know that they'll ever have the time to appear every episode,
I think just from the comments that the messages I've gotten, I think people think that this is they think that this is like a swap outable thing. Mm-hmm. This is the set people of the podcast. This isn't like we're not shuffling people in the community. Mm-hmm. This is the 6 that are doing the podcast. And then the plan is like for people, if we know in advance that they're not going to be here, it would be really awesome to get someone to sub in. And I'm perfectly willing to actually sub myself out if we actually have a really cool guest, just to put in my place, because I think it would be very cool to have some other people.
You'd be the first I'd cut too. Yeah. So.
I'm not that important.
There are lots of people in the community that have that I think would have a lot to contribute in this sort of podcast format. So there's quite a few people I've got in mind that I really want to have a conversation with. So I think that'll be interesting when we get around to it. So
if you guys know people that you want us to interview, also it does not have to be Blender specific. At some point, we are going to be moving the podcast into general CG general stuff. Like right now, of course, since we are Blender guys, we're going to be talking about Blender stuff, but topics are going to start to broaden out as we just eventually you'll run out of things to talk about in the Blender community.
But I also think it's important to note that Blender, because I get messages about that a lot, and a lot of my commenters are about that too, where they'll talk about kind of like Blender versus Cinema 4D, for example. But I think it's important to note that like Blender is now part of the professional 3D industry, especially with these new studios popping up and using it. I mean, I Lost My Body, which just got nominated for an Oscar, used it with the grease pencil, and now they're using it at Epic Games and Ubisoft and all these other game studios. So it is part of the 3D industry. So even if we're not talking specifically about Blender, it's like Blender is now part of the 3D industry and recognized by professionals. So by talking about that, it's still relevant, for those people that are kind of worried if we get off topic of Blender.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you guys have suggestions, you don't need to put Blender Guru or who's the other guy that everyone keeps asking about?
CG Geek, probably.
CG
no,
Geek.
it's
Ian Hubert as well.
Gleb Alexandrov.
Don't put Ian Hubert or Blender Guru in there because we already know. I think we get comments about that multiple times a day. So we would perfectly love to have those guys on there and talk to them because they're very fascinating people. So let's get into today's topic. So we're going to start. I wanted to ask you, Curtis Holt, about your Bhaijan add-on. For those of you who don't know about the Bhaijan add-on, it's this incredible add-on that's free, and you could take just a base mesh, we'll say like a sphere, like a subdivided sphere, and you go in and you open up the add-on. You can click, different parameters. You click on it, and it uses procedurally changes up that mesh, and you get this really cool mesh. You can get some organic stuff, you can get some hard surface looking stuff, and it is all done in the modifiers. It's completely editable. Nothing's final. Like, how if you do a sculpt, you have to hit Control-Z to undo that. It's all done in the modifier, so you can change it to however you like. And it's a really incredible, really unique add-on. So I wanted to ask you, how did you come up with the idea, things like that, when you did the genesis of that project?
Well, I've always liked generative type stuff. And I like the idea of how can you get the most artistic control out of clever procedures? Because I think it's something that's sort of lacking in the 3D space right now, but we're seeing more of it with AI implemented technologies to help with generating both 3D and 2D type, artworks and projects. But the modifier stack in Blender, I think, is quite underappreciated because it's got a lot of potential. And I know there's people like Midge out there who are doing some really good stuff with it. But there was one turning point, I think, and on Twitter, Emiliano Colantoni, who's an artist I really like following, they were doing some really clever stuff with generative, hard surface faceting styles. How you can get these really cool shapes with it. And I just thought, wouldn't it be cool to have a little tool that would just, you'd take your mesh, you click a button, and it would boom, make it in that style. So over the course of 1 or 2 days, I just learned how to make add-ons for Blender with Python, and then I implemented that. And I really didn't think it was going to go anywhere. Maybe 1 or 2 people were going to download it because the following wasn't that big at the time. But Bhaijan was a really important project for me because it was the moment when I've realized what is possible with producing things online for a community. Because when you start off making stuff for YouTube, or for me anyway, it's always this balance between making things that you enjoy making, really enjoy, and making things that you think people will watch, that will get views, and deciding which side to go for more. And Bhaijan for me was definitely a passion project, as well as stuff like personal artworks and things like that, things that you really want to make but people aren't necessarily going to watch. So I made that and put it out there, not really expecting much, but it was the first project where it spread so quickly after the launch that I couldn't keep track of everywhere it was being mentioned online. I started seeing articles popping up literally the next day and the following few days. And that was really a revolutionary moment where it was oh, hold on, maybe you can do things that you just want to make and have them do well at the same time. So that's what made the project really significant for me. So
I have a question about it. Without giving away your secrets, I was just I was looking into add-on development, and I'm thinking how you'd even approach something like this. Is it something related to each modifier is a number? You make a sequence of numbers, and that chooses what order you're making modifiers in? How do you even approach something like this?
So the interesting thing about Python with Blender is, and this was quite unexpected for me, it's ridiculously intuitive from a scripting standpoint because so much of it is reliant on strings. So if you want to add modifiers, for example, you don't need some weird code for a certain type of modifier. You literally just object.modifiers.new, then subsurf in capitals, as an argument. And then the next argument is another string for the name of it and stuff like that. So everything's been built around having these really understandable strings to use. It makes it really easy to automate procedures. It gets slightly more complex when we're automating generated textures for Bhaijan, because some of the modifiers, like the displace modifier, you create a texture with them, and that's handled by Bhaijan as well. So you then need to like create a texture object separately, which is stored in a separate area of Blender. But you can access all of Blender's data through the Blender API. It's like bpy.data, and then you move through there. So it's in a different area. You make that data separately, and then you link it up with a new modifier that you've created. So it's really simple to understand once you actually get down to it.
So you said a bunch of words that even I don't understand. Could you briefly explain what Python is and what's its use?
Yeah, so Python is a scripting language, and its definition is a little bit fuzzy because usually you have like compiled languages which take code that you write and then they convert them into more of a binary format where the computer can read through it really quickly. And then you have, on the flip side of that, scripting languages which don't usually compile, but the program will read the text that you've written and then just do instructions related to that. But Python is like this weird hybrid language in between, where it's both a scripting language and, in a way, a compiled language. Because when a Python script runs, it makes a copy of the file with a different file format, which is basically like a compiled version of it. And if it sees that that version exists, then it will run that instead, so it will run faster. But anyway, Python is a scripting language which a lot of developers or software developers use to allow people to write extensions for their programs. It's quite simple to implement. Its syntax, so how it looks, how it writes, is very similar to English language. So, for example, in more compiled languages, if you wanted to say, you wanted to check if a true or false value was true, you would have to say if, and then you would open up these brackets. You need to get the grammar right, otherwise it's not going to work. And then you put the variable name, and sometimes that's just enough, but sometimes you have to do like 2 equal signs and then true, so you're comparing it. But with Python, you could just say like if variable name, and it will just assume that you're going for true. Or if you want if this is, you can literally write like is or is not. You can write it in English, and then the value, then it checks it. So it's a scripting language which is designed to be much more human readable, which makes it really, really good for people that want to write extensions for programs without necessarily having the core programming knowledge that's required to write the program in the first place.
Yeah, I've talked to a couple developers that work in Python, and I'm all design, no develop. I'm not good at that side of the 3D world, but like the developers that I am familiar with and acquainted with, they seem to love Python. I think because of its simplicity and just its organization is what they usually speak to.
So when you thought about making this add-on, you said you had to learn how to make add-ons for Blender. How did you what did you read? What did you watch? What did it take you from not knowing how to make a Blender add-on to making this big add-on that everyone loves?
Yeah, so it only took me a couple of days to make the first version because I have a lot of prior experience with programming in general to start with, but also Python add-on development, because I'd done some Maya add-on development for a robotics company, Robomocha, before. So I had some understanding of how Python works, but not in the Blender environment. Now, resources to learn how to apply that in Blender are quite readily available, but JNM is the YouTuber, the Blender YouTuber. He's done a mix of videos, but he does some really good Python development ones for Blender. And the main ones that I watched were, because 2.8 added some new requirements for add-ons, mostly just like some syntax changes or requirements for what things should be called. He was really, really useful in laying out what those requirements were. So I took notes from there. Also, the documentation for Blender, it's got a pretty solid documentation for Python development. Some things are a little bit outdated, but what I did was whenever I had an issue and then looked it up and then found that there was a new change or the old tutorial code didn't work, then I would make a note of it and I would keep it all in a special black book for Python notes. So I've got all the little tricks in here. So yeah, J&M, documentation, and prior experience.
Do you expect to have to do a lot of updating for this stuff, or only when like 2.9 stuff goes around, or do you just have to change that thing in the beginning, the preamble where it says like, oh, it's this version of Blender, etc.?
Well, the funny thing is that little preamble doesn't really matter that much because
that's just for reading, like it doesn't do anything.
Yeah, but yeah, I need to keep an eye on Blender API changes. Obviously, they try not to change stuff too much, which is nice because there are some other softwares, cough cough Unity, that change things quite often and make it quite difficult when updating. But Blender seems to be pretty consistent so far. But naturally, because Blender is a very fast changing software, we've got a lot of developers working on it. I'm expecting, and I wouldn't be too frustrated if I needed to make some major changes. In fact, I've only had to make a couple of minor adjustments between versions, which broke a couple of the styles. And it was to do with the build modifier, I think. It was like they changed the range of one of the build modifier values, so it moved back. But in the end, the result of the Bhaijan add-on was that when you applied the style, it just made the mesh disappear, which wasn't good. So I needed to like shift it.
That's not a very good style. Yeah.
In my college classes, I have taken a CSS and HTML class, so I know like a little bit of the idea of like having to code and stuff like that. Well, if you mess up one thing that's parented to this, it just breaks your whole thing. Yeah. When you were developing the add-on, how often were you having to like pull your hair out trying to figure out like what's going wrong with my code and having to redo something? Like, did you have a lot of that?
Before we jump in there, can I ask one more question related to what you asked last? He asked you where you learned, and you kind of talked about where you went to learn for Blender specifically, but you didn't really talk about where you had learned Python previously. I know you said that you used it on Maya, but did you take courses? Did you read books? Did you just get in there and practice? Like how did you get that core knowledge so that when you wanted to do Blender things, that's all you had to do?
So to start with, the first time I ever played around with Python was using books, and I've got a couple of really chunky books. I can't remember who they're produced by. But yeah, there's lots of books available, but there's also interactive websites. I don't know if Code Academy is the name of one, but there are websites where you can learn how to code, and Python is a really easy one to learn online because it's a scripting language. There's nothing to compile. Usually there are quite a lot of websites that have these interactive text areas where you can type, and then it says what you've done wrong, and then you can run it in the browser, so that helps. But for me, it was mostly just books and experimenting.
Cool. And
then moving over to Ducky's question, developing the add-on with Blender was actually not a very painful process because of Jax Luke, who's the developer of animation nodes, I believe. He wrote an extension for Visual Studio Code, which is a software for writing code, which lets you connect the program up with Blender. So, for example, you can write your code in the program, and then you can just push a hotkey. And if you've got an open instance of Blender running, you can update the add-on without needing to close Blender and reopen it. So I can write the code, push the hotkey, and then try it right away without having to like reset everything. So it made prototyping really easy and really quick. And another thing about the extension as well is that it links up the console of Blender with a terminal inside the program. So any errors that Blender discover will immediately display inside of VS Code. So that made it a really smooth experience for development.
So are you ever using the text editor at all, or are you doing everything in Visual?
Well, when it comes to doing the things like the space station generator or the make generator, I feel confident enough to like not need that. So I just do it straight into the text editor in Blender, because again, that's quite fast to run. You just Alt plus P to run the script, and then you can just like press space and search for your operator. Done. So yeah, but because the Bhaijan add-on is split across multiple files, it's easier to do with an external text editor. But because the space station generator and the make generator are just one big script, that for me is easier to do inside of the blend file.
How rewarding was that when you finally finished it and you had this working add-on in Blender? Like how cool was that for you when you were able to just play around with it and you couldn't wait to release it?
Well, it was really fun for me because so rarely does it happen where like you enter code, you run it, and then it works right away. And I was hitting those moments quite a lot when building the add-on. Like you push the button and oh my god, all of those little lines of code worked. Yes, this is great. Putting it out was quite a nervous thing because I was immediately worried, and this ties in with what we've talked about in previous episodes, having imposter syndrome, worried about what people are thinking. I was thinking, okay, this is my first ever add-on. Am I going to get a swarm of other add-on developers that are more experienced going, oh my god, why did you write it this way? Oh my god, this is so inefficient. So it was a little bit apprehensive, but after people started using it and like the download numbers exploded and then people were writing about it elsewhere, it was really cool, and I really enjoyed that experience.
Do you know how many downloads you have right now? Do you know that number?
Yeah, there's over 20,000 users, I think.
Wow.
18, awesome. Over 18,000 of them come from Gumroad. Over 1 to 2,000 are from Blender Market as well. It's free on Gumroad. Blender Market, it's $1, but a percentage of that goes to the Blender Development Fund.
Yeah, just incredible. So for people understand how big that number is, I make a product on Blender Market. I advertise it. It gets 30 sales. So like 20,000 or 18,000 is like ridiculous.
Yeah, like my most successful product, I think maybe has 200 sales. So 20,000 is incredible. Congratulations. That's a very big feat. And
and it makes me feel bad though, because like I wasn't planning on that doing well, and I've had all these other interests. So when that suddenly does well, and there's all these other things I want to make, I'm like, oh, should I stop doing those things and then just focus on that? But like I've supplemented it with a few updates since then, and I've left it for a little while because I wanted to learn some other things, which is why I did some of the other generation tools. But I'm really getting back into the swing of it now. In fact, my next video going up on the channel is going to be a Bhaijan tutorial, and I've been working on the next update for it, which is hopefully going to be the biggest one so far. So yeah, I'm looking forward.
Are you allowed to leak what you're doing on it for the next thing?
I'll keep it quiet. I'll keep it quiet for now, because I might if I say something about it now, that means it's set in stone, and I might want to remove it and like change it around.
Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah, I have a problem with like putting stuff up on Instagram, like, oh, this is coming out, and then most of the time it's all right, video out tomorrow, and then I'll have to change something. It's like 2 days later.
Yeah.
I wanted to sorry.
I was gonna say that's like a CG Matters molecular thing.
I have like 3, and I got comments, people like he never follows his word. And
what happened with that? I don't even.
So there's this 2 add-ons. One's molecular. You've probably seen it. It's like a lot of like particle physics stuff, and the other one's Cube Surfer. I make a dope, probably the best trailer that could ever exist for it. I'm like, tutorial coming soon. And it's been a couple months because I know how much work it's going to be, and I just don't care enough to do it, and I don't want to do it, so I'm not gonna.
Oh man. So I wanted to switch gears over to Southern Shoddy. Yeah. So you're big. You have this character that's been running on your channel for a while called the Goober, which kind of looks like an avocado with an exploding head, and that's how I would describe it.
Yeah.
Which I believe the genesis was the video that you talked about the AI denoiser, correct? Or was there another time where you sort of premiered that guy?
I had started posting them. So initially, when I was doing like my Blender artwork, I was actually posting on my Instagram and focusing on my Instagram. And there's this really great After Effects animator named Motion Marcus, and he had built a really successful Instagram following, and then started doing tutorials on Instagram, and then started releasing like paid tutorials that were kind of locked behind a Patreon wall. And I initially thought like, oh, this would be like a good way to kind of maybe make some side income, is to kind of provide people with some free content. And then if they want to learn more, they can kind of like support me that way. But so I started just posting on Instagram all the time with like just little characters I'd come up with, and the Goober character was one that I had made. And I actually, oddly enough, I was filming on a film set, and I just had my iPad, and they were taking these long takes, and I was just sitting there for like an hour or two, and I just pulled out my iPad and drew them there. And then I decided, I was like, okay, I'm going to try him in 3D, and I wasn't good at Blender then. It was awful. And then years later, I was like, I'm going to redo him. I kind of like the look of him. And then it got shared across Instagram, and it didn't go viral by any means, but I only had like 800 or 900 followers at the time, and it got like 5,000 likes and got shared on all the other channels and got like a bunch of attention. And I was like, oh, people seem to like this design. So I did a couple more. I rigged them, and then I did a couple like little animations with them, and I kind of did it in that clay shader style that a lot of people see me kind of do on those platforms and things. And people seem to respond to it really well. And so then when I started my YouTube channel and I was going to upload my first tutorial, the one you're talking about was the AI denoiser video, and I put him in there, and that video hit at just the right time, because you know, Blender 2.8 was coming out. It was big. Everybody was talking about Blender. They were adding this AI denoising feature. And then I kind of had a clickbaity title, which is like, you're going to save so much render time. And then I think Ducky helped.
That's the video that I shouted you out on.
Yeah.
That video got like 60,000 views. And I made like, you were at the very beginning of the video. So people clicked on it a lot.
Exactly.
It was like this culmination of all these great things. And I was so happy that the video did good.
Yeah.
I love the work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And for anybody watching or seeing my channel grow, Ducky definitely gave it a huge kickoff. And then a lot of other channels like CG Boost have shared it, and I'm grateful for that too. But so he kind of helped kick that video off early in the algorithm, plus the fact that it was trending, plus the fact that people seem to respond well to that character design. So he was in the thumbnail. So it was just like a culmination of things that made for me to get a bunch of views on this video when I had no followers. I mean, I started with like 15 followers because, you know, my mom followed my channel and things like that. Like, so then once that went up, it took off. And yeah, I think for anybody who follows my Instagram or things, it's like the Goober character shows up a lot because I animate him a lot. Because once you've kind of made a rig and designed a character, that's a lot of work. And I think putting all those things together and stuff, you can reuse those assets, especially when people like it. And I wouldn't say he's a mascot for my channel or anything, but he's certainly the character that most people point to.
The next project I wanted to ask you about was Baby Yoda, which I believe is the biggest thing that happened, at least to your Instagram, that I've ever seen. And I've been following you for about 2 years. Instagram was how I found you. You posted those Halloween renders, and I was like, I like this guy, and he uses Blender. And then you'd reached out to me like 7 months later. But the Baby Yoda thing blew up. So could you talk about that process and like sort of everything that went into that from the beginning?
Yeah,
and all that. People love it.
Yeah. So Curtis talked about how you have passion projects, and then you have projects that you think people would like. And every once in a while you get lucky and those kind of two things cross over, you know, and Baby Yoda is just meme fuel. Like, I mean, he is just everywhere. And I mean, I think he's finally dying down because the series is kind of on a pause, but like, I mean, I was just as obsessed with him as everybody else was. And I saw that Beeple had made so for anybody who doesn't know or who lives under a rock, Beeple is a Cinema 4D artist that posts one post a day, and he's just got this insanely huge following. And he had done this image of a bunch of Baby Yodas eating a Jabba the Hutt, and it went nuts. I think it was like, it looked like Justin Bieber posted it. It had so many hits, and I was just like, oh my gosh. And he posted on his Twitter, he's like, my friend, which a shout out here, Pixel Urge is the guy who made the rig. He's like, my friend made this Baby Yoda rig, and they'd kind of designed it to be more of like a stylistic render. And I took it into Substance Painter, and I kind of used some smart materials and things like that to retexture it to give his skin more like creases and things like that. Pixel Urge had actually done everything in Blender nodes. I think so that like people downloading it was just easier in a smaller file, and it looked great. But I went into Substance Painter, painted out the skin and all that, and then decided to animate them. And I kept getting all these questions about doing character animation, and I was like, Baby Yoda, this Baby Yoda rig's already all good to go, and he had it like rigged with custom controls and everything like that. A lot of times when I'm making my characters, I don't do custom controls because it just adds hours and hours of work when it doesn't matter when I'm just animating it, you know. So it already looked artist friendly. So I was like, well, I'll do a tutorial with like this guy's rig. And I think I asked him before, or he had it like in the license that basically you could do anything with it. So I just like mentioned him and that it was his, and went ahead and did this tutorial and showed people how to do character animation, you know, with this Baby Yoda rig. And again, it was just a storm of perfect things that came together to make the algorithm just like really take off. And it did pretty well on YouTube, like 60,000-70,000 views, but like Instagram, it rocketed.
I'm looking at it right now. It has 80,000 views and 10,400 likes.
And like that's just on my page, and at the time of posting that like rocketed me up like 2,000 followers. I think I only had like 5,000 or 6,000 followers, so that's like a huge reach. Plus the fact that it like everybody shared it. Like it just kept getting picked up by all these curator pages, and I should have saved them all just for like a case study. But like all those pages, like minimum were getting 5,000 likes and 30,000-40,000 views. So it just like, if you like total it up on my page and all these other pages that were reaching non-Blender audiences, it just like, yeah, it blew up. And I think that's because like in the show, I mean, he looks incredible, but he is a puppet, so they kind of avoid close-ups of him, and there's not much like CG animation with him. And I think that's part of it, is because there's a ton of Baby Yoda stuff out there, but there's not much like Baby Yoda with facial animation. And granted, it was a super simple animation. I think I did the whole animation and render like the lighting setup and everything in like 2 hours, so I didn't spend much time on it, but yeah, it blew up for sure.
Do y'all know how much? I know the answer. I'm seeing if y'all. Blew my mind. Do y'all know how much the Baby Yoda puppet cost, like Disney, to make?
I know. Oh, the puppet? Yeah.
The puppet.
Yeah.
No, I have no idea.
If I'm not mistaken, it was $5 million.
Mm-hmm.
What?
$5 million. I mean, if you watch The Mandalorian, it's an incredible puppet. I mean, it moves, it walks, it has all these facial expressions. The ears move. It looks amazing. But I would have guessed like maybe 10 grand.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
5 million.
I heard about that because the stormtrooper who punched it, like Jon Favreau was up there helping direct that episode, and he called him up and he's like, look, I want you to give a good performance, but I just want you to be aware this thing cost whatever the number is, $5 million. And the guy was like, "Ooh!" And then after that, he like barely hit it. I was like,
that's my favorite scene in the show. It's so funny when he's like, "Shut up, bap!"
Yeah.
But one thing I wanted to say about your render was, as far as I've seen, you were the first one to really animate Baby Yoda. Like everyone had still renders, or like they did drawings, they did other things. So you were the first one to really like give some life to a Baby Yoda render, which is one thing I think that people really loved. And also you had some really beautiful compositing with some like glares and with some lens flares and stuff like that, which I think really added to the realism.
I think,
and that was huge. It was so cool to watch it all happen.
Yeah, it was. I was excited about how well that did, and I hope that one day one of my characters will do that well. But I mean, Baby Yoda is just a gorgeous design. But yeah, so in terms of animation, I guess I never thought about that. But even now, I don't really see any animation. I have seen some other people use that rig for animation, but not much. And then in terms of it's funny that you bring up those light leaks and the bokeh and the dust and all of that, and like the lens flare, because it looks, I mean, it is intentional, but it was honestly there to mostly cover up some of the like lack of photorealism in my render. And because like I didn't spend a ton of time in Substance Painter, and I'm also just not normally a photorealistic artist at all anyways, so I actually used a lot of that stuff to kind of cloud the composition to kind of like distract your eye from the kind of lack of realism in some areas.
So what did you do all that compositing in? Of course, obviously the depth of field is in Blender. Did you use any other programs, or did you use the compositor for any of that post-processing and things like that?
Yeah, I used the compositor for part of it. I use Adobe Suite and After Effects a lot, and After Effects is not really great for 3D compositing necessarily, but it's what I'm comfortable in and what I use. So I use that for compositing a lot. You could do everything I did in Blender. I didn't do anything that couldn't be done in Blender. I just knew I could get it done faster in After Effects because I'm just more familiar with that software when it comes to compositing. But I did do some of the compositing in Blender, and I use when I composite in Blender, I oftentimes use like the mix alpha nodes and the curves graph and the I love their lens distortion node. I haven't found anything as good as that in After Effects. I don't know who wrote that, but like kudos, that looks great. And then of course I did the denoising in there and a lot of that. But in terms of like the bokehs and the lens flares, a lot of those were stock footage. And even if they weren't, you can buy stock footage of it, or you can find free stock footage of it. And you can just overlay all of that in Blender. I mean, with their mixed nodes and whatever, they have all the same, features. So you don't have to leave Blender to get those results. I just chose to because I was faster, just like Curtis chose to, use Visual Studio to write his code.
Also, on a side note, if anybody's trying to get into the tutorial world, the tutorials for the compositor are very lacking on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
So if you love the compositor and you know some really fun tricks and how to, a good course on that, get in there because I'll watch it because I need to learn. I use it almost like none at all. So if you guys even here want to make some tutorials for the compositor, I will definitely be viewing that because I need to learn that.
Yeah,
I put one out actually. I had a spaceship over LA. I don't know if you guys saw that. Kind of got buried in the whole thing. And I go over the basics of it. Nothing like too in depth, but it did pretty well.
Yeah,
but
that's a really cool spaceship.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I definitely want to do more of those as well. So anyone else wants to jump into it's a nice node-based compositor. I've used Shake, Nuke, Digital Fusion, and I gotta say, like, the Blender compositor is not that bad. It's kind of like on par with like the Houdini compositor. You don't have like the deep compositing stuff that you might have in like Nuke and some of the other stuff, but you can fake it pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really great, and I think they used it exclusively when Blender did their visual effects short film for the Blender Foundation film that year. I think they used the compositor and Blender for everything. I may be wrong, but I've thought about doing some tutorials on it kind of from like an After Effects standpoint. The problem with me, and I think probably a lot of artists who try and use it, is that so when you're compositing and mixing elements like that, there's a lot of color tweaking that goes on. And with Adobe suites and some of the other suites you mentioned, a lot of those like color tweaks are like visual. So you have like graphs and things like that, where when you want to get into the kind of the minute tweaking for Blender, a lot of their kind of like specific color tweaking things are more, it's like a slider with numbers. And I just think that for artists, that's a little harder to work with. So
yeah, like I haven't seen scopes. I don't know if it exists in there, and I haven't found it. But yeah, scopes in other applications are really useful. Once you learn what you're looking at, it's kind of like staring at the matrix. But once you learn what's there, oh man, it's so useful.
There's a screen you can actually buy just for like your DSLR, and it has like scopes on it while you're filming. It's very expensive.
The Ninja.
For those of you who don't know what scopes are, it helps you see I have a limited knowledge of it, but it has things where you can see exposure, like what's overexposed, what's underexposed. It lets you sort of see all the weird things going on in the background of your video, so you can get a perfect shot for things like that, which would be amazing for compositing.
So I went to film school and we had to learn them. So like just a tiny bit more detail on how they work. It's like usually, and you've probably seen them, it's like usually you have a graph and there's like a red, a green, a blue, and like a white, like smear of color. And at the bottom you have 0, and at the top you have 100. I think that's the range it is. And it's like the top are your whites and the top are your darks. And then, red, green, and blue are the three, colors that are mixing together, and then your white's kind of like your overall exposure. So you kind of like go into your white and you'll like set it to the top and the bottom to kind of get your blacks and your whites exposed properly. And then after that you'll kind of go through and you'll play with these like smears to kind of get either the effects you want. So you can go into your greens, and it's like if your greens are all smashed to the top and you don't want greens in all your highlights, you can kind of pull those greens down. And it's like Ducky's saying, it looks crazy. Or it was BlenderBench said it looks like the Matrix at first. You're just like, oh my gosh, what is this? But once you know what you're seeing, it's kind of cool. And actually something that's kind of funny is if you're like on set and you have basically like a black background and a person with lighter skin and lighter clothes like walks by, you can almost see like the shape of the person like in the graphs walking around.
It's the Matrix.
Yeah, it's cool.
Cool. Well, I wanted to switch gears over to BlenderBench. You created a MRI machine thing. I don't know too much about it, but if you could discuss, you made something with MRIs and medical things like that. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, my brother and I used to have a company before we moved out of New Jersey and they dissolved us. We we got contacted by Hitachi, and it was a really interesting project because I'd never kind of done the hard surface stuff, and I mean I had before, but never to like to the degree that I had to on that project, and it was really interesting because they would put out an MRI machine. I'm thinking like Hitachi, like they make all these like consumer electronics. Like, you guys do MRI machines? Like, oh yeah, that's like a big thing for us. Like, oh okay. So they sent us some of the CAD data, and I was like, as how the only software that I had available at the time at home was Blender, and I wasn't gonna open this at work because it's kind of a conflict of interest. So I was like, all right, let's see what I can do here. So I was able to actually bring it in. I think it was like Blender version 2. I think it was 2.78 or 2.79. 2 point. Sorry, I get slammed every time I say 2 dot something. It's 2.78, and I was able to actually bring it in, and I had to remodel a lot of it because I didn't have Right Hemisphere at home, which was an awesome program for derezzing any kind of CAD data. It would take anything from like CATIA or Pro Engineer, and you can bring it in and change it to whatever format you want. But I didn't have access to that, so I had to kind of remodel it from the start. So I was able to actually go in and learned a lot of modeling in Blender. I was able to do it really well. And then we set it up in there, and then we kind of created animations that I rolled into an FBX at the time, and then brought that into Unity. And inside Unity, we were able to make prefabs and assign all the FBX states, and actually have this thing interactive. So you could have the camera zoom into a certain part of the MRI machine, and then it would expand and show like what it's doing. And I had no idea. Like, I mean, magnetic resonance imaging. Like, I mean, I kind of understand what it does, but I wasn't, super techie at the time, like going, oh, I understand everything about this. But I was able to actually, talk to the people there and say, oh, this is really cool. So I learned kind of a lot about how it works. And so we brought it into Unity, and we're able to make it, kind of fully interactive, where you could kind of, move your mouse and swing it around and help them, talk to end users, hospital staff and techies who would run these things, and go and sell it. And it ended up being a really interesting project. But Blender was, one of the things that really kind of saved me on that, because if not, I would have had to buy Maya, and at the time it was $8,000 or something. It was something ridiculous, and they didn't have the monthly subscription yet. So Blender really came to the rescue there. And then
how long did you
really? Sorry,
you can continue. I have a question after that.
Yeah, go on.
So how long had you been using Blender before you got this big project?
In any kind of like professional capacity, that was really the first of the big ones that I did in Blender. Before then, I think I mentioned in an earlier one of these podcasts that I just checked it like every year, and every time I saw that that little 3D cursor come up, I was like, nope, close it again. Nope, close it again. And then I think I saw like a Gleb tutorial or a Blender Guru tutorial, and it was like, I can't remember what it was about, but it was really, I was like, wow. It was talking about cycles, and he was talking about some of the modeling features, and I was just like, all right, you know what? I'm going to suck it up, and I'm going to go and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to figure this out. And I'm going to like do this muscle memory thing. So I went solid for, about a week just using Blender for this project. And I was like, all right, this is great. And I was able to actually use it. And I'm like, wow, more people should probably use this. But at the time, they had transitioned over to a more forgiving interface. Like, everything wasn't at the bottom of the screen. Like the earlier versions were like 2.5 and below. So everything was more laid out in a way that I could use it. And I just kind of got excited about it and started using it on and off.
So when you got this project, how much did you have to learn about this medical industry, and how much, like, from the knowledge you didn't have, how much did you have to talk to them and learn and try to figure out the scope of this and what you need to know to actually tackle this? What was all that?
It wasn't too deep, but it was deep enough that I had to understand what it was doing. So I had to understand why certain components were where they were, and it really helped in zeroing in and animating the things that they wanted to show. So when they broke it apart, it would be kind of feasible and they can talk to it as opposed to just kind of randomly throwing a camera at it and going, hey, this is this. Like I could actually say, all right, I can move the camera in ways that would focus on the areas that they wanted to show. And I had enough of a rudimentary understanding about like what part of that related to the other parts that they wanted to show. So it was kind of a very kind of a basic broad understanding of what this thing did, but it was enough that it really helped me finish the project in a way that made them really happy. And then the more I learned about it, the more I could talk to them about it. So they got more excited about it and had more confidence in me, because it was like total imposter syndrome. I was like, I don't know medical. I don't know this. I should have gone to medical school, but I didn't. But then in learning about it and understanding more and asking the right questions, I could ask even better questions of them. And then they got really engaged, and it was just it ended up being a really good project because of that. So I say the thing that helped me was taking a real interest in what they did instead of going, it's kind of like whatever, I just have to animate it. I was like, oh, well, let me learn about it. And then I could, they got excited because I got excited, and it played off each other.
How long did the project take you to do?
It was about a 2-month project.
Okay.
Between iterations, and there were a lot of iterations. They come back and ask for different things, and but luckily we bid on a cost plus model, so we were able to make changes without getting hosed. Always go cost plus, by the way. Always.
What's cost plus mean?
It means you're going in, you're saying, all right, we'll do this for this amount of money, and then any changes after that, like once you agree to this, any changes will be extra. Which is kind of how most industries work.
Yeah, that's how I do my freelance. Yeah.
Except for visual effects doesn't seem to work on that model right now. So
more the hourly. Yeah, I haven't worked hourly yet, but most of the time I work on cost plus, which is a great model, because clients, the issue when it comes to working with clients is a lot of times they don't know what they want. Mm-hmm. And if they know what they want, sometimes they realize that's not what they want after, and things like that.
Yeah,
all that kind of frustration.
We could maybe do an episode on freelance pricing and things like that, because I know
we should definitely do that.
I don't know about Curtis and CG Matter. I don't know if you guys do. I know that because I know Curtis, both of you guys do add-on development, so I know you guys get additional income there. And then CG Matter, you upload so many videos, you probably get enough money from that. And then, but I know Blender Binge is, he's like me. He's like always working. And then I know Ducky's doing freelance basically full time, and I think Grant does freelance full time. Yeah. So
so talking about doing projects, a lot of these were kind of solo, and for the two of you who do work at a studio, when it comes to working with people, because I know a lot of people use Blender are very hobbyist or freelance, so you pretty much working by yourself, but you guys definitely have a good amount of experience of actually working with people, handing off things. What's that like to sort of have to deal with other people and working in the projects, and what sort of input would you give about that type of thing?
Who do you want to talk first?
You can talk first.
Okay. So I work at a studio called The 3 in Kentucky, and they do it was born out of an agency, so they do a lot of like client work with brands like GE, and a lot of restaurant work with things like Fazoli's and Longhorn, and they have a lot of cool technology there, a lot of like 3D work, a lot of architectural visualization comes with GE, and then with like a lot of the restaurants, we're oftentimes like mixing 3D in, and then we've done full 3D spots before. So we have quite a bit of combination of 2D and 3D. And it's funny because when I first signed up, they told me that like, well, you use Blender, but we're using Cinema 4D. Can you learn Cinema 4D? And I said, sure. And so I started learning Cinema 4D, but there was a couple projects that the turnaround was like too quick for me to use something I wasn't as familiar with. So I like switched back to Blender to get it done really quick. And then they came out with 2.8, which had Eevee. So then I started using Blender 2.8 in Eevee, because there's a lot of pieces we do where it's like it'll come in at like 10 a.m. and it's got to be done by 3 p.m. And they're like, we want to make this telescope like rotate in 3D for this like Longhorn spot. And I'm like, okay. So I do it like in real time rendering, because it's like just for an email, so it's not like it's got to be like crazy photoreal or anything. And I started using Blender Eevee. So it's funny, when I signed up, they're like, yeah, we need you to learn Cinema 4D. And they weren't like anti-Blender, but they're kind of like, let's just push that under the rug and not use that. And then now like our team manager's like, wow, this is great, use that. And so now I use it quite a bit. So I use both back and forth. So that's just kind of like the background of like how I'm using Blender at work. But in terms of working with other artists and working in a workflow, Ducky's absolutely right. I oftentimes feel like Blender is a lot of independent artists and hobbyists and things like that. I do believe that with the game industry, that's changing drastically, and with these new films coming out. But when I'm working with other artists, there's actually a lot of formats that allow us to go back and forth together. So the other CG artist there, he uses Cinema 4D full time, but like it's easy, especially with Blender's updated Olympic support, and now they're using, you know, Pixar's new like scene export system. It's gotten really easy to just pass scenes off to him so that I can do my portion in Blender and pass it off. I also used Blender on a video for Facebook. They were launching a new feature at one of their trade shows, and I was the only Blender artist on that project, and it was mostly a 3D spot, and everybody else was using Cinema 4D. And again, we just used Olympic data to kind of like go in between programs, and I rendered my pieces in Cinema 4D or in Blender and just had to match their style, and then I passed them off assets as like FPX files and Olympic files, and in the future I'll probably use Pixar's file format and just kind of work there. And then in terms of like Adobe and After Effects, like Blender works great. I don't know, it's not like supported officially in the new versions, but you can like tweak a line of code or two in the like After Effects export script, and like you can use it in the new versions. And if anybody's listening that can update that, do that, because like it's tired of having to like tweak it every time. But I'll oftentimes like export those assets and pass it off to kind of like other people on the team that are using like After Effects and things. So that's kind of how we use that in the pipeline. I mean, it's just like any other piece of software. It can export PNGs, it can export 3D files, so it works with most things, you know. And if I'm touching it from A to B, it's like I usually use Blender because I'm just a lot faster in it. And anything character focused and anything that we need rendered quickly, I oftentimes use Blender. And then we switch over to Cinema 4D for like architectural visualization a lot. I mean, Cinema 4D is really strong for that and some of its MoGraph features. But we recently did a 3D character animated piece, a 30-second spot for a hospital, and we did that all in Cinema 4D. And we kind of, at our post-mortem meeting, decided that next time we'd probably use Blender because Blender is a lot faster for character animation. So I know that's not like necessarily any industry secrets or anything, but it's just like especially with these recent versions, and especially with 2.82 and some of the upcoming updates for 2.83, they've made Blender much more studio friendly with its import and export options, meaning that like what you're talking about that traditionally has been a pain for Blender no longer is, you know. I think it's much easier to work with other software now, and I'll let BlenderBridge take over. Yeah,
so BlenderBridge, what's your experience with having to work with people and all that stuff, and sort of what are some of the frustrations that comes with having to work with other people in a group?
Well, it's a team dynamic issue, and it's a lot of personalities. I've been very lucky over the course of my pretty much my entire career that I've worked with some really excellent people that are really, really cool and are easy to work with and don't have egos. I hear different from a lot of friends of mine who work out in Hollywood that you know, they come across a lot of the egos and things. But you know, from a human standpoint, it's really important to just be as cool as you can be. Don't hoard knowledge. I come from a place where if I learn something, the first thing I want to do is teach it to somebody else. It just helps humanity in general, and B, it helps me cement the knowledge in my own mind and proves to me whether I really know it or not, and I get better at it for that. So I've always, you know, in my team, it was the same way. If somebody learns something new, we show it to the whole team, and everybody, you know, is on board. So if, you know, somebody has to, you know, take a day off or duck out or something, it's not a big deal because somebody else in the team can pick it up and run with it. And ultimately the team is stronger for it, and the project is better, and the customer's happy, and the money flows, and everybody can go eat. And it's always been a very important part of working with a team is just to be open and to be cool. And you can tell the people who have the egos and they hide and they try to hoard the work and they try to do underhanded things behind people's back. And I've seen it actually in other departments in the companies that I work at. But you kind of don't want to be that. Does that answer that question?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay. And I work in a larger tech aerospace engineering type company. It's not Boeing. and we see a lot of different tech coming in and out. Primarily my team uses Houdini and a bunch of other software, but the primary pipeline in the group that I'm in right now is using Houdini, and the group that I was in before was using primarily Maya. And we had Blender installed for quick and dirty, fast type jobs like Southern was talking about. And I'm seeing a lot more stuff because we're a large company and everybody, you can download Blender on like the network. We're seeing a lot more groups popping up, especially engineers that are trying to do their own stuff in Blender, and they're sending us their files. So we're starting to see more of that coming in, and this is in a Fortune 500 company, so it's starting to happen. And I think that the fact that Blender, especially 2.8, is more studio friendly, is more of an environment that can take in Alembic and push out Alembic and FBX and all that. It's starting to play a lot nicer with other software. And I think there's like this, not a homogenization happening, but there's definitely an integration happening where Blender is becoming, if not a pipeline itself, because it's kind of not yet. It doesn't really have that extensibility yet. And I'm saying yet because it will, but it's sort of like a ZBrush where it's going to be everywhere. Like people are going to be using it, and it's going to have its place in a company. So anybody listening to this who thinks, well, I shouldn't waste my time learning Blender, if you want to go get a job immediately, Maya and Houdini and Cinema 4D are huge, or 3D Studio Max even. Like learn those, spend your time on those. But you can learn a lot of the basics in Blender that can now, especially with 2.8 in the interface, you can take those skills and easily transfer it over to any other software. And like like Southern was saying, we have all this different software that people are using, and it really just comes down to the concepts. So you can fit that stuff in, and you can use Blender, and it's a great tool, and you can totally like become professional just starting in Blender and then being able to branch out.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody who works at a studio can really function if they only know one piece of software anyways. I mean, you're always going to be using multiple pieces of software. And to the point he made, it is getting so many more features and things like that, and it is being used more. And I think it's also important to note that the hard ops add-on for Blender is pretty standard in the game industry. And I mean like big games. I mean, that's what they're using to work at Epic Games and Ubisoft and, like all these other major studios. And I have a friend who works on like Sony exclusive games, and he can't always tell me what he's working on, but he just contacted me and said, hey, I'm trying to learn Blender. Can you? Because they're using it at the studio more. So it's just like, it is in the industry. So I think pretty soon you won't have to ask yourself, can you get a job in Blender? I think it'll be just as common as those others. But regardless, there's a place for it everywhere. And I don't think you should worry so much about one piece of software as much as learning a couple pieces,
Yeah, we used to get into these, they used to call them flame wars on the internet, where people would just, like, my software is the best, and I never want to learn Maya because Lightwave can do everything, or I never want to learn, and like there used to be, I think ArtStation is kind of the child of, maybe I'm wrong, but it was Ballistic Publishing had CG Talk. I don't know if any of you remember CG Talk at all. It was a forum, which is like ancient technology now, but it was like where a bunch of artists got together, and these threads would pop up. It's kind of like Reddit except more formalized. And man, like all these people, like, I hate Maya, or I hate Lightwave, or I hate Softimage, and it's just like, why? Like, just learn the concepts, and you'll be so versatile the more you learn.
Yeah,
you'll be so much more of an asset.
Yeah, my boss uses mostly After Effects, and then one of my coworkers uses almost exclusively Cinema 4D. And just watching over my shoulder and what I do in Blender, now my boss wants to learn After Effects because he likes the grease pencil, he wants to learn Blender because of the grease pencil. And then my Cinema 4D friend, he wants to learn like Blender because it's like the real time stuff, So it's just, it's like you software fluency is very important in a studio environment. Just being open to it, you know.
Yeah, you never have to be an expert in those other software. Like you can have your primary software, but if you can open up others, like I'm not an engineer, but I can open up CATIA or Pro Engineer, and I can kind of do what I need to get that data out into, you know, the art packages. And I have no love of that software, but like I'm open to learning it because it helps. You know, you're going to get those jobs that come in. You're like, all right, how do I do this? You know, I only want to work in this software. Well, you might get a job where you have to reach out to other things and work in there, and you'll just be better. You'll be a better all-arounder if you do that.
There was something you said earlier, Blender Binge, that I really liked about sharing knowledge, and how if you share knowledge, you tend to learn it better for yourself as well. And I found that quite a lot.
Awesome.
Since starting a YouTube channel, I found that I haven't learned things this fast like previously. It's just that when you start like repackaging the information in your head, like, okay, even if I'm not going to do a video about it, if I'm learning about something, I start thinking, okay, how would I explain this to someone? And that's just like a mental practice as I go, but that tends to help anyway. So just that practice, I think, is something that people could take on board.
I think so too, and I think a lot of people have, you know, when they have that scarcity mentality of like, oh, I can't show this to anyone because then they're going to know how to do this. Like this industry is, I mean, it's in its infant stage. It really is. Like, yeah, there are jobs that are, you know, all over the world now. There are things, you know, there are geopolitical things that happen, but honestly, as a community, like there is so much work out there, and so many projects come down to like the stupidest little decisions that you have no control over. So for me, like sharing knowledge, for me, I willingly share it, because honestly, like you never know, like somebody out there could learn from you, and you know, 10 years down the road could be in a position to say, oh my God, I learned this from this dude. Let me see if he's available for a project, or let me see if he wants to come into this company. Like I've had this happen so many times that the benefit, like hoarding knowledge is never, to me is just it's a backward way of thinking. So when you grow so much more as an artist or as a person when you teach. I mean, kind of went off on a rant there, but yeah.
I mean, all of us started growing in our skills and in terms of our social media presence once we started sharing more knowledge, you know.
Oh yeah.
So
one thing I noticed as well is, sorry, just quickly, that once I started sharing like my little tips and tricks for like the Python add-on development, I started getting more and more emails from people just asking for like consultation and information. Because once they see that you're willing to start sharing, then they just come to you because they trust your take on it, rather than like looking for, you know, the information to scrap together for themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think that just about wraps up this episode. This was awesome. I learned a lot. I hope the guys, everyone listening, had a good time and learning from these, you know, y'all experienced artists, things like that. And so, yeah, thanks for being here, everybody. Thanks for watching this third episode of the BlenderNest podcast. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Check out the Patreon.
See ya.
And check out next time to see if you see my face.
Eventually. It's the tease.